So thank you for the introduction, Roy, and thank you, AJUG, for bringing me down here to Atlanta. Funny enough, this time last year I've never been to Atlanta, and then now in the past 12 months I've been to Atlanta 3 times, so that's just kind of funny. Anyways, my name is Billy Korando. I am a software consultant with Keyhole Software in Kansas City, and I'm going to be talking today about reliable and portable integration testing with Spring. And before I forget, if at any point during this presentation you have a question, please feel free to ask. This is obviously a meetup, so pretty soft time requirements. So yeah, ask questions. Let's make it a conversation if you're really interested. All right, so a little bit about me. So I'm actually really excited and interested in talking about automated testing, and I want to give a little bit of background on me to kind of explain why. So I've been developing software for about 10 years now, and during that time I have worked in insurance regulation, electronic health records, shipping, finance, and government. As you can see, a lot of really fast-moving, really interesting, awesome fields. Obviously not quite. So one thing, perhaps not really knowing it, but one question I've always kind of had is, why is it such a struggle to push code to production? Early on in my career, I was working on legacy applications, and so at least when I say legacy application, kind of talk about like a difficult to build application, or difficult to work with the application that's using a lot of times really old technology, and oftentimes one of the biggest, most frustrating parts of it is you would make a change in one area, and then it would end up breaking another area. And that kind of leads into automated testing. And I guess maybe before, how many people here are like actually legitimately doing continuous integration and or continuous delivery or deployments right now? Okay, a few of you. So at least maybe this initial part of this presentation is kind of building a bit of the case for automated testing and getting into integration testing. So this might be stuff you already know or appreciate, but hopefully even this, there might be a couple of insights. I know there's definitely been times where I've done things, but then maybe read a book, and even though it's like, oh, I'm already doing this, kind of maybe learn something a little bit deeper, a little new take on it. So hopefully at least you'll get that from this. So why do we need automated testing? So it's talking about legacy applications a little bit before, and a lot of times why these applications become so difficult to work with is because it relies so heavily on manual testing. And the feedback cycle when doing manual testing is often maybe when you're kind of getting near production, it can be maybe pretty quick, of maybe like 30 minutes or so, where you make a change, you push it to development, and maybe your QA tester tests it, and gets it back to you, but oftentimes it's going to be hours or days. And another problem though within that, when doing the manual testing like that, is oftentimes you're not getting, like you're only testing a very specific portion of the application. Maybe you're making a change to the customer page, and so you test it out locally, you push it to like some stage environment, your QA developer or tester goes and tests it, but they're probably only going to be looking at that one page you're making the change to. But then you can make a change and you accidentally end up breaking like the order page or the address page or something like that. I know that has happened to me many times. And so with automated testing, what we're getting is a much faster feedback loop and also richer feedback as we're testing the entire app is being tested, or hopefully with a quality automated test suite. And at least particularly with the faster feedback loop, that's a big point of this presentation, is trying to get particularly the integration testing portion of the application both running more quickly and also much more consistently. So before I kind of get into what is integration testing, I kind of want to talk about a little bit what isn't integration testing. Certainly I've had a lot of this confusion earlier in my career. If you've asked me what integration testing was a year ago, I would have given a very different answer than what I'm going to give you today. So I just want to help level set, because that may help understand how these tools can actually work. So what isn't integration testing? Integration testing isn't testing configuration. So a lot of times with like maybe current integration testing, you are connecting to some stage environment, whether it's a stage database or a stage instance of a service that you're consuming. And so, but with that, there's a lot of configuration of username, passwords, IPs, ports, and hopefully all that information is changing between environments. At an absolute minimum, the IP address is changing between environments. And so what that means is all this stuff is going to end up, in the background, be part of your test that you're running. And if any of that changes, your test is going to break. But that's not really giving you good information as to whether or not how your application will actually run in production. You can't connect to your dev database, but you could probably still connect to your production database just fine because maybe that configuration hasn't changed. So what this kind of leads to is a loss in confidence in your integration testing because it's breaking for things that have nothing to do with your code or anything that has changed. Integration testing also isn't testing performance. I've gone into some arguments on the internet about this stuff. And so where somebody was suggesting that it's kind of good that sometimes integration tests or automated tests take a while to run because you can also kind of stress test your system. But that's not, and of course performance testing is extremely important, but for one, you want to do that on near production level hardware because the bottlenecks may not always be linear. So if you're testing something on your local machine, the bottleneck might be memory, whereas on production, the bottleneck might be threads, or maybe it could be actual software within like a database. You might run into some sort of locking issue, table locking. So doing that kind of performance testing locally or even on developed hardware, unless it's near your production level, isn't going to probably get you the information you want. And again, that's just not the step you want to be doing it in it. There's, I think many people have seen like the testing pyramid, and maybe that's right. But like there's just different steps within it. There's unit testing, perhaps component testing, integration testing, maybe like end-to-end testing, and somewhat later on in there is where performance testing is going to come in. Finally, integration testing isn't testing business scenarios, and this is a little bit nebulous, but kind of what I'm talking about is you're not really trying to test out like I'm going to get this query is going to return exactly 10 records or something like that, just because that's not really the goal of business integration testing. We're going to be testing contracts, and you don't want to get too specific because then data can change, though hopefully, at least with some of these tools I'm going to be talking about, that shouldn't be as much of an issue. So that's what integration testing isn't. So what is integration testing? So integration testing is testing contracts. And by contrast, I'm kind of talking about like matching endpoints or tables. So if I'm going to be calling, API v1 movies, and make sure that matches up, that it's not find all movies or something else or v2. Our tables, like you want to be matching, like users table or customer underscore orders versus maybe customer orders, camel case. And you also want to be matching shapes. So, again, when calling like that movies endpoint, which actually that's going to be part of my code demo, we want to match up to make sure, or maybe that's not good, but like a user, like let's say you're getting back like F name and L name, but maybe it could also be a first name or last name concatenated or with underscore in between. So you just want to make sure that stuff can match up because that's oftentimes where like communication breakdowns can happen or just different ways of people of interpreting stuff where you initially during like planning meetings say like, hey, you're working on the front end and you're going to be calling the back end and you're going to be getting back a list of users and you're thinking like, oh, okay, I'm going to want to have as store as name as possible as F name and L name. But maybe the developer on the back end was like, hey, I want really descriptive names, so I'm going to do first name and last name. So that's where, of course, integration testing is coming in to make sure that stuff matches up. And then finally, this kind of comes from experience on my part, but I also consider testing maybe certain kind of failure scenarios to be part of integration testing. And so like at least the story behind that is at a previous client, I built a service and I had some unit tests and everything in it, and unit tests were running fine and deployed it out, all this stuff kind of so works, test worked. But then a couple of times, some people came to me and they said, hey, the surface is down, we had to restart it. So after it happened about the second time, I'm like, okay, I need to investigate what's going on. And to kind of help make the story shorter is what I found out was the DBAs were bringing down the database my service was connecting to for some routine maintenance. And my service would continue to try to connect to this database, and then those connections would go bad, and then it wouldn't get rid of those connections. The actual change is a one-line change actually within the code, but to actually test it out, I was actually having to connect to a live database because like trying to use like H2 or something like that wouldn't work. So that's kind of maybe an example of where like a specific failure scenario might kind of fall under integration testing because it did depend on that remote service. So what are some common problems with integration testing? I would say probably some of the biggest is probably fragility. Data changes without our knowledge. So you're calling, your database or another service, and you're just expecting this user back, and you're kind of maybe, and like that user has like all their fields or something like that, so you can check to make sure everything's fine. And then maybe that user, changes, or maybe it's no longer valid because it's too old now or something like that. So now your test is failing, but again, nothing about the contracts, what you're really testing for to make sure that stuff is correct, has changed. And again, that causes you to lose confidence in these tests, and this adds to the maintenance overhead. Also, of course, external services may become available. This kind of goes back to a little bit what I was talking about. Configurations could change. Options like, oh, we need to move over this database to this new server, and so that changes the IP and port number. Or maybe we're taking on a new schema for how we're naming stuff. I mean, I've dealt with that many times, and there's definitely valid reasons for why that happens, but what then that results in is your tests are breaking, and you have to go fix them, or oftentimes what it means is like, I'm not going to fix them, and then eventually you start ignoring tests. Another problem is performance. Remote calls are going to be slower, and that can start to add up. So even if a remote call is, 1 second, whereas it's maybe a tenth of a second on your local, that starts to add up, if you have hundreds of tests within your test database or within your test suite. Also, remote services can become overloaded. You're connecting to that or staging a dev database, and maybe at that time someone's running a performance test, or someone's just doing a lot of tests on it. Maybe that call's slow down, and so then again your test suite all of a sudden maybe completes normally in under 5 minutes is taking half an hour to run. So that just slows down the feedback cycle, and then that may lead you to saying, okay, we're going to only run unit tests with every commit, but then we only run integration tests at night, so we don't run into that. But then again, that kind of slows down the feedback loop, because maybe you find out somebody did make a change that was going to cause an integration issue, and now you don't find out about it until the next day, or maybe it's over the weekend. Or like somebody makes a change Friday, so you won't remember or know about it until Monday. You need to make the change. Blocking. So again, if you're trying to connect out to the live remote services, until like another developer or whoever update that service to whatever the contract changes are. So maybe you agreed like, okay, actually using a longer first name is better than F name. You're waiting until that backend developer actually makes a change and deploys it to your staging environment or wherever your shared environment is before you can actually start making those changes. So you're kind of just dead in the mud until that happens. So you're like, okay, you know what? Let's try to actually maybe try to do this locally instead of depending on shared services. And so with that comes locally configuring a service or database, and that can be very time consuming. Kind of what I was talking about earlier with the test and failure scenarios, I actually had to set up a database on my local machine, and that just took a lot of time. And then that's going to be a lot to ask for any new developer on that project to say, hey, for this one test to pass, you have to set up a whole SQL Server database on your system. Local services can be resource intensive. Even monoliths, a monolith might connect to a couple of services, but definitely with microservices, that can definitely build up. If your microservice is talking to 2 or 3 microservices, and maybe those microservices are talking to 2 or 3 microservices, all of a sudden you may have to be running like a dozen microservices on your local machine, all with their own databases, and now you can't get anything done. And then finally, syncing can be difficult and time consuming. So, okay, you took all that time, you set up a local database, but now you have to make sure that the tables and data stays in sync. Again, there's some more tools like that. I think like Redgate is one of them for at least SQL Server. But that's a whole other tool to use. And also and then maybe you're running with like a local microservice, and it's like, oh, these tests are all passing. And then you push to like int or something and it fails, and that's because you forgot to update your local instance of that because you just didn't think about it. Previous attempts for integration testing, I already kind of talked about the running locally, so I won't go over that again. But like another one is like, okay, let's do in-memory databases. Like we won't actually connect to like this Postgres database or MySQL database, but we'll connect to an H2 database. Or we won't actually connect out to that other microservice or other RESTful service. We'll just handwrite some mocks. And the problem here can be is like it doesn't always match implementation behavior. That's mostly directed at H2. Like it does say like, hey, we're going to run in Postgres or MySQL or Oracle, whatever, adaptability, but that doesn't always guarantee things are going to work the same way. Definitely, for example, stored procedures work very differently in H2 from any other database. In H2, you write it out as Java classes, but in Oracle, you're using PL SQL, and it's different in every other one. So like that can have important differences that you won't find out until you actually are connecting to a real one. And with the handwritten mocks, no guarantee actually also matches what the remote service looks like, or you could also, again, run into the syncing issue. And finally, maybe you say like, okay, staging or develop or whatever shared environment you're using, like that gets overloaded all the time. So we're going to talk to ops again, and we're going to set up, staging 2 or whatever. We're going to add like another instance that we're going to connect to for when running integration tests. But that's just like another instance for ops to maintain, which kind of comes with like some of the issues of syncing and all the maintenance work involved. So let's talk about some of the new tools for integration testing. It's actually funny. So we're always mentioning how Spring Cloud has been released, and actually I'm using Finch release on this right now. I updated it. But anyways, the first tool I'll be talking about is test containers. And has anybody here heard of test containers? Okay, a couple. Cool. So test containers is a library for setting up and tearing down Docker images within your JUnit test. And so that means there's no setup beyond Docker, obviously, on development machines. You can have an instance of like of whatever kind of database you're wanting to run, and then share that with you. So again, that also reduces the syncing issue as well. You can just bring it down to the latest one when you're running the test. Spring Cloud contracts. I'll get into that a little bit later. I'll kind of cover what I actually mean by less resources and confidence your mocks are actually match reality. Any questions at all yet? All right. So I'll first take a look at test containers. Is that big enough for everybody as well? Okay, great. Maybe a little too big. All right. So as I mentioned, test containers is a library for setting up and tearing down Docker images within your JUnit test. In this case, I'm actually using JUnit 5, and to kind of register it, to tear it up and tear it down, I'm using this register extension, which I set this up myself. They're going to have an actual native one. Oh, yes. Bigger? Okay. Is that big enough? Bigger? Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't know which switch it is. Is that better?
Keep going. Go ahead. Get those ones up front.
Yeah. There you go. There we go. Can everybody see now? Okay, great. Anyway, so in this case, I am using JUnit 5, but if you're not on JUnit 5 yet, this all works great in JUnit 4. I just try to experiment a lot with JUnit 5. I actually have a few talks. I actually spoke at DevNexus on JUnit 5. Anyways, so really I'm doing a pretty simple test here. All I'm doing is retrieving a record from the database, and then I'm also adding a record to the database. And it's just for customers. And like I said, of course, this is obviously a very simplified example, but we're just kind of testing to make sure all the contracts are valid. We don't really need to necessarily go really into deep on it. So if I run this, and so yeah, this is going through the setting up, and then it tears down a Docker image. So, but one of the really nice things though is, as you can see here, I am doing reliable movies DB latest. And so this kind of helps when it comes to the syncing issue, is DBAs say, okay, we're going to make a change, and maybe they send out an email or something to say that we made that change, and you just don't see it. Just having to go through the whole work of like constantly updating stuff to maybe match whatever the latest is out there is a lot of work. So by doing this latest, we're going to always get the latest Docker image out there. So if I was to make a change to this Docker image, so we're just going to do camel case for release year. Sorry, that one a bit small. It'll get bigger here again. All right, and then updating the data as well. Source test. Okay, great. All right, so yeah, made a update to that Docker image. So now, don't need to save that. Run again. Hopefully that's great. So yeah, that just succeeded before, but now it fails because the contract has changed. And so, and of course, also, like I said, you're not having to constantly do a whole lot of work on your end to keep up to sync with, whatever changes are being made with your team. So that reduces a lot of workload on the developers. And then, and also this stuff is much portable and reliable. To get this to run locally, all you need is Docker. You don't need to do a whole lot of setup, setting up a Postgres database to get this to run. And you're not having to, handle a manual syncing of like, hey guys, we added some more data out there, update your local database to, match that data. And that's just really nice. And again, also you get that reliability. Unless something's going wrong with Docker on your local machine or something like that, you're not going to fail because the dev database is down or because they made some changes to the configuration. So that's going to greatly increase the reliability and portability of test containers. You can have questions later, but does anybody have any more questions on test containers right now? Yes?
So let's say you have your CI server building your code, and all of a sudden this Docker database changes by this other remote team. But your builds have been going on fine, right?
Yeah.
Now magically your build is broken.
Oh, well, but wouldn't that be good? I mean, because and some of that may also be about making sure you're setting up to where like the changes to the Docker images, like what they actually get deployed to production together. But it would be good to know that, hey, somebody made a change to that Docker image. That's what's going to be actually going to be used in production. So now you do want to know your builds are failing. And I think again, like kind of it's failing because something actually changed within that contract. It's not failing because somebody misconfigured a password and now it's failing. Was there something more to your question?
I guess it's like if you have simultaneous like a release pipeline going on, your code may not be ready for that change, and it may cause you to be delayed in your release in some way, right? Because let's say, oh, I've got to get this deployed today, and then now all of a sudden it's broken.
Yeah. So I guess, and if that's the case, you don't have to do this. Like, I can't. Yeah, you could do like that 3.2 or like something like that. You could give like a specific number or something like that. And I'm sure, unfortunately, I work right now with the government, and so I talk about all this cool stuff, but I'm not often getting to do it a whole lot. But I think there's probably also ways you could probably buy properties, kind of put that in there to where you can kind of find the latest, and when you're running on the integration server, you have like a specific instance you're running against, whereas maybe locally you're always running against latest or something. So.
I'd also expect you to inject it into your configuration.
Yeah.
In that branch, what is the database that you're expecting?
Yeah, exactly.
Hard-coded, but that's not the way I would.
Yeah, and exactly. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So for the first time, when we're checking the contracts and the sets, when I'm deploying the application for the first time, is really useful. But we don't change the contracts very often, right? For example, table name and RESTful APIs or whatever. So first time, this is more useful for the subsequent releases in the prod.
Yeah.
There's a lesser chance of changing the contracts and the frames and all this kind of stuff, right? So how it will be more useful from all the releases subsequent releases?
Yeah, you're right there that typically once you make something public, especially like really public to where it's consumable outside of your application, you're kind of stuck with that. So things don't change as much, but things might change or you might add to it. There have been times where I have been part of companies where we did actually go and make changes to API. So it's just there to make sure that's always correct. And, you always get that confidence that maybe somebody doesn't accidentally make a change. That if it's and then if somebody accidentally makes a change, it's going to cause a test to fail. But then you also know that test failure is because someone accidentally made a change in a way that could break production. And that's not going to get out there. You're not going to be like, oh, it failed because, that's probably like a password, change or a config change. So yeah, I agree that integration tests probably are really important, much more in initial development, and then it just becomes like a warm feeling, later on.
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe his point is that maybe it's more useful in a microservice environment to be, let's say, doing services rather than databases. You just picked a database because it was easy to demonstrate. But services are going to change all the time because you're going to have a new version.
I absolutely agree, and that's what Spring Cloud Contract's going to be about. So at least in my example, you can of course use test containers for exactly what you're talking about for when using like other services. But at least how I'm kind of describing and how I'm showing it, it's more for things like databases, caches, and stuff like that is where you would be using test containers for. But yeah, I absolutely agree, and that's why I'm using different technology for doing for RESTful APIs. Yep.
So back to the test container. Is JUnit aware across a suite that you have the same test container? Or is he going to bring it up and down for each?
So yes, you can. So like right here, and again, this Spring test containers extension is something I wrote, but they're actually, I think it might actually, they just released a 1.8, and I think they actually added better JUnit 5 support for it. But yeah, so like here in this little true, I'm telling it between each of the unit tests to bring it, to tear it down and build up a new instance, but you can use that same instance across your entire test suite. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you have the container starting and stopping so quickly.
Well, in my case, this container is just like a small Postgres container. There's not much going on in there. So, yeah. Admittedly, I don't deal a whole lot with Docker. So, you know, I can't really say how often it will work or compares to other Docker images starting up and sending down. So admittedly, yeah, when using test containers, it probably won't be as consistently as fast as maybe connecting to a remote service, but you're at least going to have like a consistent time. You're not, and again, you're going to the reliability and portability from it. Any more questions about test containers? And of course, feel free to ask anytime later if it pops into your head. Okay, I will talk then about Spring Cloud Contract. There we go. All right, so testing microservices. So like right now, let's say we are working on service A, and then service A depends on service C and B, and then service C depends upon service D. So as you can see, if we want to do like real integration testing with service A, kind of with the traditional way of doing integration testing, we would have to get service B and service B's database set up, service C, and so on. You know, that's a lot. And, you know, that's a pretty simple microservice environment. Many microservice environments could be dozens or hundreds of services, and that becomes quickly unwieldy, certainly slow, resource intensive, and so on. So instead of actually having set that all up, what if instead we use mocks? And of course, that's where Spring Cloud Contract comes in. But of course, we need to have confidence that these mocks actually match reality. It's not like, hey, I put this contract out here, trust me, this is what it is, and then you actually get, you know, try to use it for real, and it all breaks. So let's take a look at Spring Cloud Contract. So there's a couple of ways you can write contracts. For me, one of the things, particularly also in a lot of the places I work at, they're very immature when it comes to a lot of modern development practices, like automated testing is still a new concept. And so they're very standoffish about doing this automated testing. So I think a big thing I always like to try to do is try to add more value with the automated test you write, and that can help encourage people to say like, hey, okay, I might as well do these automated tests because I get so much value. So people don't like to test, and also people don't like documentation, but if you combine the two in a single step, that's going to make people at least a little bit happier, at least a little more willing to do both things. And so what that leads into is there's also a Spring library called Spring REST Docs, which allows you to do that, and then from Spring REST Docs, you can create contracts. And so that's what I'm doing here. So I have a controller. So yeah, I have this very simple movies controller, have this simple, get all endpoints, add a resource endpoint, and then a couple of endpoints for for searching for stuff by. In this case, if you look up by title, you can do that, or I have a little bit more advanced stuff, searching by genre and run length. So it's important then to tell people what endpoints exist for my service and then a little bit how to use them. And so here, that's where I'm doing that. Has anybody used Spring Rest Docs here before or heard of Spring Rest Docs? One other person, I would assume, yeah. Has anybody also used mock MVC at all? Okay, a few people. So yeah, this is, as you can see here, is using some mock MVC. And so I'm just telling you here, using Mockito, when my service is called to return a list of movies. And then down here, I'm creating a document, and I'll kind of explain all this, but it's called Find All Movies. And then I'm telling the response fields, and in this case, this is saying it's going to be an array, and then within the array, there's going to be an ID field, and I'm just giving it really simple, the movie's ID, the movie's title, and so on. And I'm doing the same for all here. In this case, down here in the add movies, I'm also explaining what the request fields. In this case, the request fields and response fields are the same, but these could be completely different, these don't need to match by any means. And then down here, I could say that here in just a second. But here I'm also doing the search, a couple of search endpoints that I have. So anyways, I can run all this. And actually, let me run the whole full Maven install. Forgot this. You could still build those out anyways. Regardless, here is what we get though from this. One of the things I know Swagger, and particularly the Spring Fox, is pretty easy to use, especially for documenting your REST API. But at least one of two things I don't like about Swagger is, one, I'm not a fan of their format. That's a completely personal opinion, but I do like ASCII Doctor, but this looks really nice. But anyways, for writing out this test, we get our documentation on all our fields. So here's the get all movies, and it's explaining, like I said, the fields, the types, and giving a description. And then it's giving an example request and an example response. And then also, oh yeah, sorry. I think I put that in there twice on accident. The response fields. But this is really nice documentation, and this is something you can give other teams for when consuming your services. And then what's really nice about this, though, is I kind of talked about earlier. It's hey, here I put together this contract, and this is what it looks like. Promise that this actually matches, but then you find out it actually doesn't. This actually does check every time you run this, which means every time it's going to be running on your CI server or your build server, that this stuff still matches. So let's say if I change this ID field to be identification, and if I run this test again, so yes, so now this test fails because the ID field isn't identified. So it's like, hey, there's this extra field here that you don't actually match up. So it's just good to know that this documentation actually matches reality. Another really nice thing, and actually, all right. So while that runs through, so Swagger, it shows all, it only shows successful requests to your services, but it's also important to describe what happens when like an unsuccessful request comes through to your service. And actually, I just added this here a few minutes ago, so this is why I'm having to rerun this. So here, I'm describing what happens, test call, so what happens when somebody tries to add a new movie, but they're missing some fields. And in that case, I'm going to return, the response is not going to be the same, it's going to be a different shape, it's going to be error messages instead. And so now, yeah, successful. So yeah, I could probably list that out better, but here's an example of a post when client sends business errors. And so instead of giving a response back of a movie shape, I'm sending back error messages. And again, here's the request and the response. And so to kind of get that all together, you have to set up this index ADOC, just so you kind of know a little bit about the magician behind the curtain. And you can take a look at this later. So anyways, that is one really cool thing, is writing those tests, you're getting both confirmation that your RESTful endpoints actually match what you're expecting to do, and then you're getting documentation. But that's not all. So what also we can get out of this using Spring Cloud Contract is we can generate these stubs. And so this is what they look like. These are JSON stubs. And has anybody heard of WireMock? Yeah, a few people. So WireMock is a server, and what you can do is consume these JSON objects and then use that to build responses for different requests that come through to it. And so with Spring Cloud Contract, it builds out this. So I need to do a little bit of work on this, but to do it this way using Spring REST Contract. But I tell Maven to put together this package, or this artifact, a stub artifact, right here. Yeah, I forgot how to do the quick zoom on Mac, but pretty much it's the same name of my artifact, just with a hyphen stubs at the end of it. And so then I have this client of movies, movies client, movies service, movies client, and it consumes it. And so I can then use auto-configure subrunner. And in this case, I'm giving the Maven coordinates of that. So the Maven coordinates of the service I'm consuming. And this little plus right here, that's telling it to pull down the latest snapshot version of it. You can do other things. You can do like star, that will be release, if I remember correctly. And you can also, I think, write out like release if you want a specific version as well. So anyways, plus. can run this. And that, of course, fails. Oh. There we go. So that succeeds. And so again, you get the confidence that these contracts and all this stuff is actually matching reality, because every time my movie service builds, that's going to build a new artifact for that, my movie service stubs artifact, which has those newest stubs, which, as we know, works because it's being checked every time itself by the mock MVC and Spring Rest contract to say this contract actually matches reality. And then that's getting put out into Nexus or Artifactory or wherever you're storing your artifacts. And then in this test here, it's pulling down that latest version or whatever correct version might be in your production environment or in your workshop environment, and testing that to make sure they still run. So you get real good confidence that these tests all work. But yet, that's still not all. Sure.
Can you show the rest of that test? Because I'm missing the piece where you actually look at it.
Oh, sorry. I should have went down. So like I said, this is doing wire mock, and so I'm just telling Rust template to go out here. I mean, this is, again, very simplified, but it's actually hitting a living server out there, localhost 8081 movies, and I'm just making sure, in this case, I recreated the movie class object within this movie client to make sure it can actually deserialize down and read that information in. Is there any other questions around that? Or? Okay, so, and again, please feel free to speak up or ask questions at any point. So one last thing that's also really cool is when doing SPA developments, I'm very much a back-end developer, but I know kind of one problem when doing SPA development and SPA testing, or sorry, front end, like using maybe like a single page application or SPA application, or just kind of any front end development where you're connecting to some back-end RESTful APIs, is that you're kind of depending on a live service, and as I kind of explained in this whole presentation, live services can be unreliable. Data changes or stuff like that, so it'd be much better to actually have something really reliable. So here, with this enable stub runner server, we can actually tell that WireMock instance to start up and run when running locally. So if I go in here, okay, that started up. Yeah. Look at that. And so now, I don't know, sorry, that's a ridiculously simple front end. I'm still kind of adding to it. But when I click this Show Movies, it's actually calling out to that WireMock instance and getting back that stub. And so what this is useful is when you're building out Selenium test or Karma test or something like that, you're not going to have to worry about that data on the back end changing or something changing. You're going to have that confidence that's always going to match. So you can actually, and again, kind of talked about before, those mocks and everything are checked every time everything builds. So you have confidence that those contracts and everything are being met, that the SPA can consume the back-end service properly. So I thought that was really cool, and I think that could just be something very helpful when running front-end developments. Any more questions then, or?
Does it generate any type of report as well?
Sorry, what was?
Type of report it generates, like number of test cases back.
Are you talking with Spring?
After running the test, does it generate a report?
Oh, like Selenium? Are you talking like that? It can. Like I said, I mean, as you can clearly see from this amazing, app web page here, I'm very much a backend developer, but I was kind of just toying around a little bit here with like a Selenium test, and it can. Oh, sorry. Very annoying. There we go. Like it does run tests, and I think you can generate reports from it. I'm not the best person to ask for that. It's just something I kind of knew from the times I've done a little bit of front-end development, which I have not done recently. And then from other developers I've worked with, I'm like, oh, that's a major issue, and I was wondering if contract can mitigate it, and it can. Oh, also before I forget, so in this example, I am doing RESTful APIs, but Spring Cloud Contract can also do messages as well. So if you're doing like Kafka messaging or RabbitMQ, you can use Spring Cloud Contract to write out contracts and make sure that stuff matches as well. You can't yet use Spring REST docs to do that, though I do know there has been like a branch created to kind of look at that, but it's kind of also been a little dead recently. But you can use Spring Cloud Contract to also do that as well. Any other questions then?
Can you integrate that with other tools to get a code coverage? Like Sonar is a code coverage. Can you integrate that with that one and get a code coverage?
I'm sorry, what was our...
Can you get the code coverage when you run your test, like how many lines of code that they forward,
yeah, so like these tests that I'm running, I'm running them as integration tests primarily. But yeah, this would also still be picked up by Sonar or whatever kind of code coverage suites that give you the code coverage. But I think integration test is also a perfect example of how code coverage doesn't necessarily give you the full story. You could be covering all your code in unit tests, but that doesn't really tell you if you can actually connect out to a remote service. And I can only say that to say is a lot of integration tests, they're going to be contract tests. You're going to be testing right at the layer where you're actually calling out to the remote service. So we're really going to be getting very little code coverage out of integration tests. Yeah, you will get code coverage from it. But, that's probably not the most interesting thing from it. But yeah.
Does it give you visibility into how many of the mocks you actually executed? So if I published a document that had 15 APIs, and my peers consumed only 10 of them, how would they know that they missed some APIs?
I don't think there's nothing to my knowledge. I don't know if, yeah. Yeah, so that would be good information to know because you'd be like, maybe we can get rid of those 5 APIs or something. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything really out there for that at this moment. Yes?
Is this the integration test? Test all the one in the slide.
Is it an
integration test?
Integration test, right?
No. Is it an integration test? No. You said earlier we should not be taking the response the response fields. We should be looking at the response fields rather than looking at response values.
Yes. Yeah. I see you're kind of talking about like what I was talking about earlier, not looking too much at values. And again, I did that a little bit for simplicity on this one. And some of that also is because like I know for certain what's going to be coming back that I will actually look at those specific values. I will say one thing. Unfortunately, you can't quite get it with the Spring REST docs route. So there's 2 ways of generating contracts. One, the way I showed you was doing with Spring REST docs. Another way, though, is you can write out Groovy contacts. And I'll give you an example here. Sorry, I always forget which one it's in. All right. So another way of writing out contracts is using Groovy like this. And this kind of gets to your thing about not wanting to test specific values. So one nice thing about actually being able to write out as Groovy is for here, I'm telling it it's going to be returning a regex, and for customer ID, it's going to return a regex. It's going to be between 0 and 10, and it's going to be 10 characters long. And that can be kind of useful to do it that way because you're not going to be looking too much at a specific value because you might run into an issue. In this case, I'm definitely doing an int, but like I'm consuming this integer, but as like a string instead of an int, and that could maybe, even though it's really do as a string because it could be 0 padding in front of it. So like on that consumer side, I could be checking it to say, making sure like I'm getting like a regex or something on that side as well that that kind of value is coming through to where I'm not actually checking too much on specific values, which sometimes you can run into problems on that. Does that kind of answer your question? I know exactly what you're saying, and that's maybe just one deficiencies of going through the Spring REST docs route. At least kind of just from my view, like I'm willing to take that slightly less utility just because you can generate documents from, or the RESTful, you can generate this nice documentation from it. But if you kind of are concerned about that, you can definitely go the Groovy route and do stuff like what I'm doing here with like using regexes of saying, you know, this is kind of the format I can follow, and then every time this is called, it's going to be something different.
Field, how do we ensure the field, like me, if I'm a consumer, and then getting a response from some other external service, so I have to make a particular call, and I have to get all the fields in the response. If suppose, if they say if they are not returning some value, since it is a null or something, if they are not returning a particular field, then I'm not getting the particular value, particular field in the email response. So I'm gonna mark the value as failure. But they'll be responding in other requests, meaning if I'm passing, for an example, if I'm giving a value, if I'm giving a value in the request, then they will respond all the fields in the response. If I'm not giving the value, they are.
So that'll just be another contract then. So this is just like one specific request and one specific response, and that's actually kind of what I show. In a little bit different way here. So in this case, I'm making a post to the movies endpoint. And in this post, I am sending all the correct fields with all the correct or valid format values. And in that case, that's going to successfully, in the real world, post down, and then it's going to respond back with the movie I just created. In this post here, I am saying, this is an error scenario, and then I am sending just empty values in this case. In that case, I'm going to get an error response back. So you're kind of saying, like, let's say I call this endpoint, and depending on what I send, I'm going to get different response backs. Yeah, and so that's how you would accomplish that. And in this case, I'm calling this endpoint with these values. I should get this back. In this case, yeah.
What will the difference between integration testing and functional testing? Like, functional testing, we especially look for value. So how it differs actually?
Sorry?
Like I have to look for the field in the integration testing. If I'm looking for the functional, like meaning I have to get this response or this request. So those will come into functional testing.
Are you sorry? Is that functional testing then instead of integration? Sorry.
No, meaning suppose if you're giving the request, if we are getting some response, we are looking for the pattern, how it comes, that comes under integration testing.
I think the difference is with the integration test he's proposing, you're not assuming that the data that you wrote when you wrote your integration test is right. You're assuming that the creator, am I getting this right?
Yeah.
The creator of the service is saying, this is what you're going to get back.
Yeah.
And if he changes his mind or he breaks something, your test should blow up. Whereas
Yeah.
if you wrote the test yourself and assumed because you wrote a document that it was right, you lose that coupling. And this is actually a place where coupling is good.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that you're right. Yeah, sorry, I was misunderstanding your question. Sorry about that.
Did I get the question right?
Yeah. So, all right. Any other question?
You've compared this to Swagger a couple times.
Yes.
One of the reasons our business people like Swagger is it's really easy to put a generated OAuth token at the top of the page, and they can do real calls. So a developer wants to play doesn't have to write any code.
Yeah.
Is that Spring tool let you do that also?
No, so it doesn't quite have that. Well, so what you could do, you would have to do a little bit more work. So like kind of how I actually have, like this is calling back to like a real WireMock out there, is you could have something that actually deploys that WireMock out there and then set up something that can actually make those calls. So like you get this like curl request here. So you just actually have something out there that's deployed out that WireMock service, and then you can use these curl requests here to actually like make that call out there. Or you can use some other tool like maybe Postman or something to make that call out there. To do that. So within that curl request, like it may have like an OAuth token, and that OAuth token, it may be checking to make sure that it's there, but it may not be really checking to make sure it's like truly valid, because you may want to make sure you have an OAuth token, but the validity of it doesn't necessarily break the contract. So you have to do a little bit more work to probably do it, but yeah, you could recreate that with Spring Cloud Contract. If you have more questions, I think I explained a lot there because I understand it really well already, that we can talk a little bit more if you want. Any other questions?
How do you debug the code? How do you debug the code?
Sorry, where's
Debugging code.
yeah, debug. So you can just, these are just normal JUnit tests, so you can run them in debug mode and see where that break is. Yeah, yep.
Is there a reason why you can't integrate something like JSON path to get that regex technique that you were showing in the version?
I haven't tried it, maybe, but yeah, I haven't tried that yet. No. Yep. No, please.
First slide, you mentioned that dependency on a team actually having to publish something before you can start your work. How does that work if they have to have already built their integration tests to generate the JSON that then gets consumed by the WireMock?
So there's a thing, and Marcin, he has a really great thing on consumer-driven contracts. And so that would just be a way of, obviously as a consumer, you write out that contract, and you can have that, again, that build confidence that you're kind of running these integration tests and make sure that they run, and then the backend team can get to them later when they finally have a time, but at least you can, during that time, still write stuff out and have confidence that those mocks that you created initially will eventually match reality.
Okay, so that goes from the consumer side to the server,
Yeah.
instead of what you're talking about earlier, the server side generating.
Yeah, so in this case, yeah, I was showing, producer-driven contracts, but then another way just could be just consumer-driven contracts instead. Let's see. I think that might be under this direct GitHub. Yeah, so here I think he actually kind of walks through a scenario of using consumer-driven contracts instead of producer-driven contracts. And I'll try, maybe tweet this link out as well, and maybe somebody here can share that. Any other questions? This is kind of like the end of the presentation. I do have a bunch of links. So for all the slides and code, you can find that both right here. Here, let me present, and also, if you enjoyed this presentation, I I do kind of cover some of the stuff I covered here. I made a Pluralsight course that I published earlier this year on effective testing with Spring. I've also been doing a lot of blogging. I'm actually kind of putting this presentation out into some blog articles. So if you kind of just want to read what I talked about in like a slower fashion, because I know sometimes at presentations a lot of information comes out and it's hard to absorb it all. I should have a few articles coming out here pretty soon, and you should be able to find them all at this link. I've also talked about a bunch of other things. If you want to get caught up on JUnit 5, I have several articles on there that talk about JUnit 5 and also the updates to it. And yeah, links to Spring Cloud Contract, test containers, and then continuous delivery if you're kind of wanting to get more familiar with automated testing and automating your deployments and everything like that. Any more questions?
In the Java version of the test, there was a DSL that had tuples for testing as well?
Yes, that's AssertJ. I absolutely love AssertJ for doing assertions, and one of them is it makes, in this case, so I'm getting back a list of movies, and then I'm telling it to extract out these fields, and then I'm telling it to test these fields, and that's just way easier with AssertJ than with JUnits. One thing before I forget, so there's Spring Cloud Contract. There's also another similar tool. I haven't really worked with it called Pact. So if you're not doing Spring work yet, I know Pact can do a lot of the similar things, and I also know Pact has now some integrations with Spring Cloud Contract. I can't really get too much into Pact. I know it, again, kind of handles the contract writing stuff, but I haven't really worked with it personally. I just know people talked about it and kind of liked it. So that's just something out there in case you're not yet using all of Spring stuff. You can actually kind of follow a lot of these concepts I talked about, even if you're outside the Spring world. And of course, also test containers. That's completely outside the Spring world as well. So, yeah, a lot of them are concepts, just using Spring as the implementation. Again, any more questions? I'll be over at Royal Oak Tavern. So if you want to ask me more questions there, I'll be happy to answer them. But thank you very much, and you've been a great audience. So.